Hello there. I want to welcome you to our lesson 3 today. We are going to be going over the books of Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. We have already, in our first couple classes, we have done an overview here of Genesis through Deuteronomy. Those 5 books we call the Pentateuch. And so we are now moving on into Joshua. If you remember, we ended in Deuteronomy, where Moses was turning over the leadership to Joshua to go into the promised land. And so we have the Israelite people now kind of waiting to cross into the promised land. And so let's go ahead and jump into that. And so we want to take a look right now at the book of Joshua. So hopefully you can see that on your screen right now. So Joshua is the first of the 12 historical books in the Old Testament. And these 12 books cover about a 700 years worth of history. And so it begins with Israel going into the promised land, and then ends with the return of the Jewish nation from Babylon. If you remember, the Jewish people had gone into exile. And so, but we'll talk about that in other lessons. So these historical books cover 3 different periods in Israel's history. Today, we're going to focus on the Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. And this is the time that leads up before the Israelite kings. Remember, God has told the Israelite people that they don't need a king, and eventually they're going to ask for one. But God himself is going to be their king and their leader. And so Joshua, the book of Joshua, tells us about Israel taking the promised land. Then the book of Judges will tell us about the military leaders. They called them judges. And so these were men. And also we have one lady that is in that group. And anytime Israel had gotten into trouble, God raised up a judge who would rescue Israel and seek to get them back on track. And then Ruth is kind of an interesting book in itself. It's a love story from the time of Judges that tells of God's loving care. But it's also more than that. We learn that Ruth has a part of the ancestry of the kings, and we learn from the book of Ruth the line of David and how that comes about as God will use King David in the future. The second period in Israel's history was the books of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. And so that was 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And they cover really the timeline of Israel's kings. They begin with King Saul, as far as being the first king, and so then they cover all the kings that are to come. The books of Samuel record Israel's early king Saul and David, which we've said, and then Chronicles tells us it's during that same period, but it covers different accounts and stories. We pick up on a lot of the different kings, and there's some accounts that mirror the same as in Kings, but also pick up some stories that we don't pick up. Then the last period there is Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, and this records events about God's people after the exile into Babylon. And so Ezra describes the return of the Jewish people from Babylon to Jerusalem. Nehemiah tells us about the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls. in exile, returned from Babylon. And then Esther tells us about God's protection of his people in Persia. And so those are the three different periods which the historical books will cover. Again, we must see all these books, we must see them in the light of God's promise to Abraham that God is going to bless the world through Abraham's family and descendants, and that God is promising them a land, and that if they are faithful, God is going to bless them mightily. If they're not, they're going to not be blessed, and they're going to receive curses. And that's really how the story is going to play out. But we begin to see it unfold. And so as we move into the book of Joshua, Joshua's name means the Lord saves. And so God is going to use Joshua to help Israel defeat its enemies. He's going to help Israel to move into the promised land. If you remember from the stories that we saw, I think it was in the book of Numbers, where God had sent spies into the promised land to kind of spy it out before the Israelites had gone in. There were 10 spies who said, hey, there's just no way we can take this land. But there were two, Caleb and Joshua, who said, we can take this land. And so God uses Caleb and Joshua and makes Joshua the leader of the people. Even Moses doesn't enter into the promised land. And so anyhow, Joshua is going to be the person that God is going to use. Now, the book was written, the book of Joshua was written by Joshua, and Eleazar, the high priest, and his son Phineas probably did some of the writing as well, but written by Joshua, probably around 1350 BC. So we'll leave it at that. So purpose, themes, and structure. Joshua's purpose was to show how God fulfilled his promise to give Israel the land of Canaan. And so there are two important themes as we go through the book of Joshua. First, there's the possession of the land, right? God has promised the Israelites a land, a place where they can become a covenant community, a place where they can live for God. And the second part of this is that the covenant between God and his people, right? And so God has promised the land to Abraham, and so it becomes important and crucial that Israel is faithful to their covenant with God. And so Israel, in the book of Joshua, we learn that Israel renewed the covenant through two ceremonies recorded in this book. One was at Mount Ebal, and Joshua builds an altar there. The other is at Shechem, where Joshua wrote down the renewed covenant in the book of the law of God and set up a large stone as a memorial and witness to that covenant. And so these become important because each step of the way, if you notice, each step of the way, each book of the Bible that we go through, God is always continually moving people back to remember the covenant that he has made with them, that covenant which began with Abraham to be a special people, a tribe, a nation that would stand and live for God. And so the book of Joshua is structured in three major parts. And so these parts are the preparation to enter the promised land. That's chapters 1 through 5. So that first 5 chapters, it's Joshua getting the people ready to go into the promised land. And then we have chapters 6 through 13, which is Israel, the taking of Canaan. It shares with us the military battles that they go through. And then chapters 14 through 24 is the settlement of Canaan. So basically, it's getting ready to go into the promised land. It's then the battles of the promised land, and then it's the settling in to live as a covenant people. So Most of the events, looking at the historical background, most of the events in Joshua probably took place within 10 years of the time Israel crossed the Jordan River into the Promised Land. And they determined this date based on Caleb's statement in Joshua 14, 7 through 10, that it had been 45 years since he had spied out the land. And Israel had spent 38 years wandering in the wilderness. So the 7-year difference is the time between Israel's crossing the Jordan and Caleb's speech. So the development of the message of Joshua, again, it's pretty self-explanatory, at least we've explained it already. It follows in 3 stages, right? Israel's preparing to enter into Canaan. That's a military preparation, but that's also a spiritual preparation. And so God is going to prepare them. Matter of fact, the success of the military preparation will show their success and even failures as they begin to go into the land. We have some unique stories as they then go into the land in chapter 6 through 13, which then it moves. Israel begins to conquer Canaan. And again, spiritually, when they were faithful to God, God moved in a mighty way, like the walls of Jericho and the community of Jericho. But then they were unfaithful, didn't listen to God. And so spiritually, that affected them. And they were routed in a smaller community. Then again, the message moves to Israel settling into Canaan, right? They're entering into their rest, their Sabbath of sorts, where they will be a different people. Now, again, the book of Joshua is a very bloody book. There's a lot of military that goes on, but it's what Israel. It's kind of the beginning stages, and so we have to be careful, especially as we look at Joshua, to think that this book somehow wants us to be a violent people. We have to understand the history of where Joshua's at in the Bible and what God was doing at that time. There are going to be things we know now that when we look at Joshua through the eyes of Jesus, that's just a temporary thing, that ultimately God was wanting to share a message of peace and nonviolence that we see in Jesus. So the theology of the book, Joshua shows that God is faithful. And that's going to be a theme throughout the book of Joshua, that God is faithful. Matter of fact, it's God that's working. It's not even the people fighting the battles. God takes it upon himself. And he says several times that he is involved in Israel's victories. Joshua says that God himself was the commander of the army who brought out Israel's victory. And Joshua also shows that God was faithful to his promise to give Canaan to Abraham and his descendants. So really the theology of the book is what God does, not necessarily what his people do. His people are just simply to trust him, but what God is doing. So that leads to, how would you preach this book? And I think you focus on God. And God delivered the Amorites to be defeated by Israel. God, made the sun stand still in one of the battles. Joshua says that the Lord fought for Israel. And so I think when you preach the book of Joshua, you talk about even modern day, where we're at today, that God is in control of different events, and that he's our protector, he's our defender, he's the one fighting the battles, and that we don't have to worry about that. And that will preach, because that is something that we need today. So you can look at your assignment stuff later in the class here, but here's just the outline. That Israel prepares to take the promised land, right? And then we have different events. Joshua becoming the leader, military preparation, spiritual preparation, and then ultimately the Lord is the commander. Second part of the book, Israel divides and conquers Canaan, right? These are the battles and how that begins to be divided out amongst the tribes, and then Israel settling into Canaan. And so that is the book there of Joshua. And so we now are going to move to the book of Judges. All right, now we want to proceed here to the book of Judges. And hopefully now you have that on your screen. So Judges now is the people of Israel are now in the land of Canaan, the promised land. So it tells about this book tells about God's rescuing the nation of Israel through different leaders during that time. They were called judges. Now these judges, they didn't necessarily always have rule over whole areas. Think of them, a lot of times they were regional in their rule over different sections of Israel. But when there was a section within Israel that was struggling or having problems, God would raise up these judges. And a lot of times they were more like military leaders and governors all in one. And so these were leaders that God used between the time of Joshua and the Israel kings. And so it's interesting, the variety of these different leaders. Some of the judges we have just a few lines on. Others, like Deborah. We have a lot of material on Deborah, when we look at some of the judges, not all of them were good. Matter of fact, a lot of them were unfaithful at times. And like Samson was just a really dirty character at times, but God still used him to bring about his glory. But Deborah did some amazing things, and she was a wonderful leader and helped bring revival back to the land. And we have different judges like Gideon, who would take a small army, right? And God was going to work with a smaller group of people. So we just have a lot of variety in these judges. So the book of Judges is named for the judges that God has appointed to lead his people. So authorship and date, tradition says that possibly Samuel, with some of the prophets, other prophets, maybe compiled the book of Judges. What's important to know is sometimes when we're doing authorship, sometimes there's some debate over who wrote these books, but just know that the Jewish people and Jewish scholars accepted these books as from God, and so that's what's important. So scholars believe that Judges was completed probably maybe between the time of Saul or just before Saul and David's conquest in Jerusalem. So some of the purpose, themes, and structures. The purpose of Judges was to show the results of disobedience to God, and finally the need for a righteous king who would lead Israel to God. Now I know this is in our notes here. I believe, maybe a little bit different than this statement that I just made, is that God was never wanting the Israelite people to have a king. He eventually would bring a king to them because they cried out for one, but God wanted to be their king. And so I think that's important to know and at least to think about. Some of the themes of Judges focus on the ongoing disobedience of Israel as they fail to learn from their mistakes. The book of Judges is about being faithful and unfaithful, obedient and disobedience, and just goes back and forth. So some of the things that the people did not do is that they failed to completely conquer the land of Canaan, and so their lack of faith and obedience to God becomes an important theme in this book. But God is always faithful. God is faithful even though the people are not faithful, and so he's always raising up leaders. This part I highlighted, it says Judges is structured to demonstrate Israel's cycle of decay during this time. And what's funny about this is that they're just a young nation still, right? And they've just entered into Canaan, and they've begun to settle it, and yet the decay begins right away. And so it begins by noting Israel's failure to complete the conquest of Canaan, right? They didn't get rid of all the peoples that were supposed to be in there. That was something they were supposed to do. And so this story will continue through Judges as they rescue Israel from the judges will rescue Israel from their downward spiral of disobedience. And then Judges concludes with a series of stories that demonstrate Israel's extreme immorality and need for God's ultimate rescue. And that's an important thing. The book of Judges is really a book about how God's people can be unfaithful and disobedient, and God rescues them, and then how God's people can just go to an extreme immorality, and they begin to look like the cultures around them, rather than being a set-apart people. Remember, they've come into this land to be a set-apart people, not to be like the nations around them. And so what they start doing is they want to be like those nations, and so that's why they want a king. God doesn't want them to have a king because he is their king. But they begin to act like the nations around them, and they do evil and wicked things. So some of the historical background, while the book of Joshua emphasized Israel, an Israel that conquered Canaan through trusting God, Judges tells the story of an unfaithful Israel who suffered frequent defeat because they disobeyed God. And that's just huge part of what Judges is. The period of Judges in Israel begins with Joshua's death and brings us up to pretty close to when Saul becomes king. So development of the message, Judges develops its message to show the complete spiritual decay of Israel by the end of the book. I mean, you're just going to hear this over and over. And as you read the book of Judges, you're going to see that it's just an awful mess. And so early in Judges, God pronounces his judgment upon Israel for their disobedience and lack of faith. And the last verse of Judges really tells it all. It says that everyone in Israel at that time was devoted to their own interests and nothing more. There was no king, there was no leadership in the land, so everybody just did what they wanted to do. The message in Judges is developed through 7 cycles of oppression and deliverance. And so God continues to rescue when they get in trouble. And so these cycles have 5 steps to them. So usually what happens is that Israel sins. Israel is oppressed because of their sin. Israel cries out to God for help. God saves Israel. And then Israel enters into a time of rest. And so an example of this in Judges chapter 3, verses 7 through 11, Israel is serving idols, and then Israel is oppressed by the Arameans. Israel cries out to God for help. God saves Israel through the judges, Othniel, and then Israel enters in this time of rest for 40 years. And this really becomes a cycle that we see working itself through Judges. Is this 5-part cycle works its way continually through the book of Judges. So at the end of the 7th cycle are stories that demonstrate the personal and national corruption in Israel. Talks about a man named Micah. Wasn't a prophet, not the prophet Micah, but he had idols made for his house, and he hired a priest to manage his household place of idolatry. And later the tribe of Dan stole both Micah's idols and his priests so they could have their own tribal religions. And so these groups that were just to honor and please God began to break off and began to really worship like the countries around them. There's a group of perverted men from the tribe of Benjamin that raped and murdered a Levite concubine. And this crime was so disturbing that this Levite cut the concubine's body into pieces and sent it to the 12 tribes so that each tribe in Israel would know about it. And so Israel teams up against Benjamin, nearly killing all the men of that tribe. And so it's just an awful, awful situation. The theology of Judges emphasizes the importance of God's mercy and grace, even though Israel is not faithful. He delivers Israel through these judges. God proves himself to be the faithful partner of the covenant, while Israel violates the covenant in almost every way they can. I mean, God does everything he can to help them, and they just continue to be unfaithful. And so we see a lot of God's mercy and grace with this. So talking about how would you preach this in your church or your church plant? And I think there's a lot here. We live in a world that often encourages us to do whatever we want to do. And Judges shows us that if everyone followed that advice, it would be just disastrous. And so you could focus in on that. We live in a time of judges as well. And we're called to look to God as our leader. And so there's a lot there. Judges has many examples to prove how important it is to obey God and how a nation will crumble into chaos if it does not. And I think more than just a nation, how the church, if they don't obey God, they will crumble as well. So here's just an outline of Judges. The first 3 chapters, their deterioration, Israel's deterioration. Then Israel's delivered 7 times through 6 campaigns, right? These are the different judges. And again, these judges were not necessarily ruling over all of Israel. They were regional judges. So you had in the southern areas, you had the judges Othaniel and Ehud and Shamgar. The northern campaign was Deborah and Barak. And the central campaign, you had Gideon, Abimelech, Tola, Jair. The eastern campaign, Jephthah. And then the second northern campaign, judges like Isban, Elon, Abdon. And the western campaign, the judge of Samson. And then the book ends on Israel's evil, their idolatry, immorality, and just war within Israel itself. And so that is an overview of the book of Judges. So now we will go to the book of Ruth. So we now move into the book of Ruth to finish out our lesson time today. And so just a couple things here on Ruth we want to point out. Ruth is a story of love and redemption. So Ruth is actually a Moabite woman who, for the sake of love and family, leaves her home and her heritage in exchange for life with the people of God, of Israel. And so what's amazing about this story is that Ruth is going to be a part of the promise that God has made to Abraham's people. And it's interesting that God is going to bring an outsider in to be a part of the family line of King David, and we'll talk about that here in a moment. But we have the authorship and date. No one knows for sure, but tradition holds that Samuel and maybe some of the prophets during that time wrote Ruth. Ruth was probably written sometime around David's anointing as king. So that is important. The purpose of Ruth is to show God's loving care, his providence and redemption are always active, even though we don't always see him working. The themes in Ruth are redemption and God's desire for all to believe in him. And so the redemption theme is illustrated through Boaz, who is the kinsman redeemer for Naomi and Ruth. The story is that Naomi, her husband and her sons die. And so she is going to return back to Israel, to her hometown. and Ruth, one of her daughter-in-laws. She tells her daughter-in-laws not to come with her, but Ruth wants to come. And so Boaz is going to be a kinsman redeemer who has the responsibility of paying the price to redeem a poor relative out of slavery. And so we have Boaz illustrates how God is going to redeem us through Christ. So this is kind of a connection to Jesus. The kinsman redeemer must be related by blood to those he redeems. The kinsman redeemer must pay the redemption price. The kinsman redeemer must be a willing redeemer. If he doesn't want to redeem, then it goes to the next relative to do that. So the theme of salvation is a big part of that. Ruth is structured to highlight Ruth's demonstration of love, both her love for her mother-in-law and her mother-in-law's people, and ultimately it'll be her love for Boaz. So historical background, the story takes place sometime probably, even though it was probably written during the time of King David, it takes place during the Judges. And so it's during that time of decay that we talked about in that book. So the development of the message, Ruth's decision demonstrates her integrity and faith, her decision to stay with Naomi, when she doesn't have to. Naomi's poor. Then she's going to take care of her mother-in-law, her decision to obey. And the result of Ruth's decision is that God redeems her through Boaz, who's the kinsman redeemer. We've talked about that. Ruth shows God's guidance as we talk about the theology. Ruth shows God's guidance and hand in the lives of common people. He's in control of every situation, no matter how big or small. And he's in control of this situation. And the reason this book has been written is because Ruth is going to play a part of the story of redemption of really literally the world, as through her family line, and with Boaz, the world will be saved. So redemption's an important part of the theology of Ruth. And so the uniqueness of how to preach it in your church plant. So Ruth's series of decisions to be loyal, obedient, and righteous in everyday life helped make history. And her union with Boaz made her the great grandmother of King David. And so I think that's important. The way that you can preach this is that we don't know how God's going to use us. We might seem like we're on the outside, like Ruth. She wasn't even part of God's chosen people, but she marries into it, and God redeems her and uses that situation, and she becomes a part of God's story. And so the outline is pretty simple here. From Moab to Bethlehem, that's when she was living in Moab, and then when her husband dies and her father-in-law dies, she then goes with Naomi and stays with Naomi. And then Ruth cares for Naomi and also meets Boaz. And then Naomi and Ruth seek redemption from Boaz, and Boaz redeems Ruth. And Ruth ultimately, again, becomes the great grandmother of King David, who we know that King David is a part of God's redemption story. And so those are our three books: Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. And so these are some great books. But until next time, hope that you have a great day in the Lord.